Welcome back to Narrative Dive, where we discuss the narratives that dominate our world. Today, we're going to be talking about something that we've all heard about, and it has multiple definitions: cults. What are they? What can they mean? And how do they manifest in society? I'm Jessica Buchleitner, your resident journalist.
And I'm Angela Natividad, your resident mythologist.
Join us as we define the narratives that represent the word cult. So the word cult has become part of our vernacular, especially in the English language. We throw that term around a lot. We talk about the cult of Taylor Swift for Swiftie fans. We also talk about Charles Manson as a cult leader. And this term seems to be something that we use loosely, sort of like the term DNA. We say it's in our DNA, and then there's the scientific definition of what DNA actually is. So we're experiencing this sort of double phenomena with that word. And what we hope to do today is dive into both definitions of this term so that we can look at the narratives around each. Now, the first definition of cult usually refers to a system of religious veneration or a type of devotion directed towards a particular figure. It's usually some kind of larger than life person or figure or representation. And the second definition of cult is a person or a thing, which could be an object as well, or could be a brand even, doesn't necessarily have to be a person, that is really popular or fashionable with a particular group of people or a section of society. Now, those two definitions have quite a lot of distinguishing characteristics because in one sense, we're talking about enthusiasm over a product, brand, or celebrity, right? In the other definition, we're talking about some historical movements which have been incredibly destructive, violent, and have resulted in things like mass suicides or mass murders. And so we really want to look at the narratives around both and ask some fundamental questions. How interrelated are these narratives between these two split definitions? And how much, if we were looking at a Venn diagram, and how much do those circles on that diagram really overlap between those two definitions? Can excitement about a celebrity be fundamentalist, or is it just something light and fun for entertainment purposes? Can a person who necessarily believes in a leader like Jim Jones, could this just be something on the periphery of their life? Does it necessarily have to be so extreme? I think, of course, in his case it was, but that's what we really want to look at, is how do those narratives overlap today?
So let's first look at cults from the perspective of the ancient world. The first thing to understand about cults is that the way that we think of them today, at least from the perspective of Jonestown or Heaven's Gate, for example, is quite new. And this is because the way that we think of religion has changed a lot. Like when you think about religion today, it's often thought of as something that you can opt in or out of. It's an affiliated group. In the ancient world, like the further back you go in time, like even into the earliest forms of humanity, religion took on a very different meaning, like the sense that we needed to find something larger than ourselves is actually inherent in even our oldest versions of oral storytelling. So religion was not, by its nature, a kind of affiliation that you join. Religion was a way of living. I think it would be, in French, we characterize this more as a kind of mysticism. Like there was very little distinction between a material world as we understand it today and a non-material world. Like the ideas of materialism versus other things that are not really there didn't really come about until Descartes, which is already quite late in the human story. So to first understand cults and how they were understood in ancient times, it's important to understand that religion is kind of a thing that people were not necessarily just doing, they were being. It was a way of understanding your place in the universe. And a big case can also be made that even if we push away from this idea today, this is still true. The Big Bang Theory, in many ways, like the way that we understand science in the Western world, is also, according to many people, a form of religion. It's like a religious approach that kind of explains the way that the universe works and our place in it. And you can talk about how real that is versus other points of view. But again, like it's a story that we tell each other about why we're here, and that also orients the way that our society works. So, in many ways, the Big Bang Theory can be treated as, like in this sense, a religious worldview. So, in the ancient world, cults were not about like, oh, somebody doing like a crazy fringe religion. Cults were just like little distinctions, most often in the pagan universe, right? Like you had the cult of Athena and the cult of Dionysus. And this was just intended as a way of distinguishing between followers of different groups. And they were quite often very loose. And you didn't have this sense of fervor in a sustained way that you do today. What is understood to be the established rules today can always be overturned tomorrow. Reality is never a totally fixed thing. Like it's a way of introducing and reminding us of the constant presence of chaos in a world that we think is controlled or that should be controlled, and the necessity of that as well. The idea of cult in ancient times was really different from the way that we understand it now. It was not like, not in most cases, like unless you were a priestess, unless you specifically devoted yourself to a deity, it was not like, it did not necessarily dictate the way that you lived every single day. It was one of many ways of interacting in a society. And every once in a while, you know, these groups and their rituals are activated in public space by necessity, like to activate an archetype that in essence belongs to everyone in the culture. So this is just like, I don't know if that's very clear, but this is the distinction to make between how we understand the cult in ancient times and how we understand it today. And the way that we understand it today is also quite Western. It's quite Anglo, although it's sort of drifted into other Western cultures now. And once again, it's very modern, and it's mostly used to make a kind of distinction, meaningful or not, between dominant religions that we consider legitimate, even if we don't follow them ourselves, like the Abrahamic religions, Buddhism, etc., and smaller religions that might more resemble what would pejoratively be called pagan religions by the Abrahamics. It's a way of sort of dismissing these things as not real or legitimate in the way that dominant religions are, even if we don't necessarily subscribe to their belief systems.
One thing that we have to realize is that our picture of how things are, there's a whole lineage behind why we think these things. Those two definitions, those split definitions of what the word cult means and what we imbue into each one of those split definitions has an entire lineage. It has an entire history behind it that goes back thousands of years. And that's why I laugh at people. And if you're one of those people watching this, I'm laughing at you right now inside, who say like, oh, mythology is just for fun, for reading. And I'm like, mythology actually shaped pretty much everything that we think now.
Still does. Yeah.
I mean, going back to ancient Rome, much of our laws even come from notions and philosophers that came from these ancient times. And over time, this all compounds. And so that's why I thought when we were discussing this earlier, it's important to establish that first before we dive into what the more modern perceptions of it are, to really see how did we get from there to here. And that's an important thing we can't forget. So yeah, what you think is a cult now was totally different definition back
Yeah.
throughout the ages. It's all changed. Like, and I do like what you said about things not being fixed, because we all need to be reminded of that from time to time. We have this illusion that we're always under control of everything. And there's so many forces at work beyond our control that in our little bubble, we don't actually think about that day to day. And I think that's actually why some people in the more sinister definition of cults fall in line under cult leaders, which we'll get to momentarily. So let's start with the more sinister definition of cult. And I think that's because when we think of the word cult, that really pops up in our mind because the news headlines are so glaring when we have a humanitarian violation around a cult or people exploiting religion for the sake of a cult. And a lot of this happens in the sinister definition. So to go back to that, it is usually, this definition is usually a system or a methodology of religious veneration and devotion. So devotion is a big word here that's directed towards a particular figure or object. So cult figures is something we're also going to talk about in a moment. Before we do that, there's two parts to this. The first part of the sinister definition of cult is you really want to ask what creates a cult leader, and also what are the narratives that they're using to really pull people into this system or this group. And then there's also the narratives of what lures people to them when you consider this. Who do you have to be? What kind of people are drawn by such narratives? And so those narratives are, first of all, a cult leader, before we dive into the narratives, backtracking a little here, a cult leader is somebody who has incredible amounts of narcissism, charisma. They're very dominant in their personality. They're persuasive, extremely persuasive. They are also they also exploit people significantly. We see that with most of the famous cult leaders throughout history. Of course, we all know Charles Manson, for example, who exploited the women in the group as objects. And they are usually also, and this is where the narcissism comes in, very intolerant of criticism and being an underdog. And a lot of the cult leaders throughout history had that in common. They were at one point in their lives, and using the Charles Manson classic example, Charles Manson was a delinquent from a very young age and was in prison multiple times before he became famous for going to prison again for mass murder. But the underdog aspect, many psychologists believe, does something to these individuals' psychology that encourages them to want to be the center of attention, to want to be the center of a group. There are two examples from the books that I wrote, the 50 Women anthology, that do come to mind that I want to highlight, because when we talk about a cult, sometimes it can be hard to distinguish between what is a group or a collective, if you will, and what is an actual cult. And there were two women in the 50 Women anthology that were in cult-like environments that still to this day have said, I don't even know if I can call this a cult. Now, we see this example with a lot of domestic violence relationships. There is a psychological implication that women who go through them, and this has been shown in many studies, women who go through a domestic violence relationship, for example, are often in denial that they actually are in that relationship. And this is a common theme that we see among cult leaders, and there are narratives surrounding that. And usually it's the them but me narrative. Oh no, I don't belong to a cult. Other people have in the past, but not me. This is not a cult. This is a loving community. So the first person from the 50 Women books is a woman named Siobhan Nealon, whose story is very public, who talks about growing up in what she calls a cult/commune environment in Southern California, 1960s, 1970s timeframe. And when she talks about this, she even says to this day, the situation I grew up in, where we were grifters, very similar to Charles Manson. Her father was the leader of this operation, and he's been compared by law enforcement to Charles Manson, to have very similar qualities to him. But what she brings up in this is that she's always struggled with the two terms. Can she actually say she was in a cult? They were grifters squatting on land, who the women in the group were used as ploys to, rob convenience stores or lure men or go to the pockets of wealthy men to fund the group. And you see a lot of the similar elements to the Manson family in that situation. So I think for an outsider looking into her situation, they would say, why doesn't she just call it a cult? And how can she not make that distinction? I think what it has to do with is what is the narrative around this situation. So Leslie Van Houten, one of the women who orchestrated the Manson murders and who committed one of the Manson murders, is now out of prison, and it raises a lot of questions of, could she reoffend? And arguably probably not, because she's probably not operating under the narratives that pulled her into this cult to begin with. What are those narratives? So we've talked a lot about that. Usually cult narratives and cult leaders that say them or that promote them are talking about several different themes. One of which is that they are the chosen one to lead the group to safety. Somehow there is supposed to be an existential or societal threat against humanity, and they, as the chosen person, the person designated from a higher entity, God, some sort of religious deity, they were designated to lead those people out of that situation. And that becomes, and you might hear me say this and just think, well, who could believe something like that? But it becomes very seductive if you're in the right mentality to believe something like that. So the other one is I'm ordained by God, and God speaks through me, and therefore you have to treat me as a prophet. One of those examples of God having ordained a person in a prophet-like state to the point where the group bows down to this person's authority, listens to them because they really believe that God is speaking through this person, is Warren Jeffs. And if you don't know who that is, he was a leader of the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, LDS. And I want to distinguish between the regular LDS church and the operation that Warren Jeffs was running, because it is quite different. And the societal practices, the marriage practices, the group is quite different in their approach to their interpretations of religion and God. So I don't want to say that they're intermingled. Let's put that as a disclaimer. But this was basically a polygamous group that was involved in child marriage. And we're seeing a situation where pedophilia was committed. There was uncovered in this documentary, law enforcement had uncovered audio tapes where an altar was built within one of the buildings on the commune, in the common ground, where young girls were taken and de-virginized and defiled. And somehow within this group, this behavior was completely acceptable because that narrative was so powerful. And that narrative was, God imbued me with this power. I am the prophet. You can speak to God only through me, not directly to God yourself. And when we go back to the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages, if we want to go back to some more, I wouldn't call it ancient, medieval history, this was a common narrative in the Catholic Church as well, that we do not have the ability to talk to God ourselves, that we had to go through another entity in order to have a relationship with God, which of course later changed. That's a whole other story. So we're seeing two common narratives here. God speaks through me. God has imbued me with this prophet-like existence or a higher power. I don't want to keep using the word God because that could mean many different things. But it's usually that this leader is imbued with a higher power, and that by interacting with this leader, this being, the people in the group can somehow gain some sort of gratification or some uplifting experience. And then the second one is the existential threat. And that's a war is coming. Charles Manson used to tell his group that a race war was coming and that they had to prepare for this war. And in order to do that, they had to go and commit these murders that they committed with Sharon Tate and the La Bianca murders. That was another one. Jim Jones, another example of probably one of the most sinister examples of cults that we have, where the People's Temple lured everyone overseas out of the US into Jonestown in Guyana, where they committed mass suicide. But they did this because they believed that this person was imbued with some kind of higher power. And so this is an important distinction to make between those two narratives. But what leads someone to believe these narratives, right? What lures people into those narratives? Why would someone be seduced with thinking they can have a relationship with a higher power through another person? And there's many reasons why. Many times that results from low self-esteem, codependency, psychological codependency, a real need to belong. So you have cult leaders who were often underdogs, right? And then you have believers who were also often underdogs. So this is an undercurrent for both of these members of this group or these type of groups. There's also a desire for absolutism. People want to define their existence. They want to define who they are. When someone comes along and promises to be able to define your existence in a way that's easy for you to believe, and this, I think this piece is also leading into how marketing and brands are able to build cults around themselves, which we'll get into later. When you're able to really define that for someone, it's easy for them to latch on to you or follow you because you've created an easy way out for them. They don't have to go searching. Throughout life, a lot of us search on this divine quest or existential quest for what is meaning? Why are we here? What is our purpose? There's so many questions being asked around that. But in the absence of having answers, when someone hands this to us in a packageable form, it's really easy to follow that. So, and then again, the desire to belong and be loved, like I've said, it's what pulls people in. And oftentimes when they find out they're in a more sinister group, they find that because of group speak and group cooperation, it's harder for them to get out of that.
It's not only cults that use narratives to their advantage, it's also the way that the word cult is used in our culture that is narrated. It's actually really interesting to look at what is considered a cult in different contexts and what isn't, which might also explain why, for example, just these women that you were referring to in your book really struggle with talking about whether where they lived was a commune or a cult, because cult in many ways is a pejorative, or it contains potential for pejorative, which is a very interesting quality that it has. So in religious context, I mentioned earlier that the vast majority of groups that get stuck with the term cult are non-dominant religions, even if dominant religions might possess a lot of their similar qualities, like a hardcore control. We're seeing that in the very evangelical Christian like Supreme Court at the moment. This idea of like interfacing or connecting with God, as we kind of discussed a little bit in the Catholic Church, the Pope is still considered the mouthpiece for God. Confession is a way of demonstrating that you still need a medium of a priest, who's usually a man, in order to be absolved. The Dalai Lama believed that the Dalai Lama is a reincarnation of previous Dalai Lama, and so on and so forth. But because these religions are considered legitimate, they're often exempted from what we would understand as cults, even if parts of these religions go into extremes, like the Westboro Baptist Church. I don't think that I've ever heard anyone call the Westboro Baptist Church a cult, even though they're extremely cult-like. And people who've left Westboro Baptist Church talk about, it's cultishness in the way that you're educated and sort of brainwashed into that mindset. But returning to sort of like these smaller, let's say like fringe communities / cults, on the religious side, it's interesting for me that the vast majority of like religious groups or communities that get this distinction of cult are usually run by charismatic men, like men in leadership, even if they're not necessarily the only ones who engage in this kind of exploitation of leadership or power or identity, right? Like Teal Swan is arguably extremely culty. So you have your exceptions there, but by and large, on the fringy religious side, we're mostly looking at groups run by men that get this distinction of cult. On the sort of casual pop culture side, this is really interesting. And I was just thinking about it while you were speaking. It's mostly women, like the cult of Taylor Swift.
Yes.
And the Bay Hive. You don't really get this kind of distinction for men, even though they can often inspire the same type of frenzy. For example, Franz Liszt, which is weirdly in classical music the first example that we have of like women sort of passing out like while a guy is playing music. this phenomenon was called listomania, and that's a term that was reappropriated with the Beatles, Beatlemania. Um, but you don't call these people, I don't know, like you never refer to the cult of Elvis or the cult of Jim Morrison. Well, maybe a little bit Jim Morrison,
I was
but
like, that might be a little bit different, but yeah.
yeah, that's kind of like playing between the lines. But the interesting thing about the fact that in pop culture, cult is mostly kind of in a fun throwaway way attributed to groups of women surrounding and venerating a woman, or like often gay men, like, you know, Lady Gaga and her monsters. Um, I think this is interesting because it's a way of conveying that there's something that could tip over into dangerous about this group. Like when you talk about like, you know, like be careful what you say about Beyonce or Taylor Swift on the internet, because you know, like her people are gonna come, like the Bayhive is going to come for you. There's this element of mob mentality that could be potentially very destructive, that is always kind of sitting at the edge of what we call a cult. And that was also, you know, like that's definitely also true for like forms of Beatlemania, but I do think that it's like taken less seriously than, you know, groups in pop culture that we attribute to cultism. Um, and all that is also to say there are also forms of benign cults and groups that are exempted from being called cults that again behave in cult-like ways all the time. Like I'm not just talking about dominant religion now. Like when you were talking about how quite often a cult might say we're a loving community, like we're a family.
Yeah.
I was thinking about how often companies say that, you know, in order to justify really toxic behavior and control your behavior, and to tell you that, you know, if you raise an issue or you've been hurt, like you're probably wrong. Like, you shouldn't do this. And if you want to stay in the loving family, you should just fall in line. That is behavior that we see in enterprises all the time. Um, but I really like being able to loosen the definition of cults and make a distinction between what are essentially benign cults and destructive cults. There's this great book that Amanda Montell wrote called Cultish that explores the universe of cults in a really playful way, and I love it because she kind of raises this point that cultishness is a spectrum and we're all subject to it. Like you also raise this question of like, well, what attracts people to cults? You know, you have this question of belonging and wanting to make sense of things, and you know, like a desire to have an organizing principle in your life. Like I think that we're all drawn to these sorts of tribes of affinity at different points in time. A distinction can be made between like sort of like benign cultishness and destructive cultishness, right? But like to begin with, like just taking the word cult and defanging it a little, there are lots of groups that don't get the cult designation that behave in that toxic cult way that we think of when we think of a cult, or that are actually kind of technically a cult but don't behave in toxic ways at all, or that do but we don't really think of them thus. Like so for example, CrossFit like very much
Yeah.
exhibits, yeah, CrossFit exhibits really cultish behavior. Multi-level marketing groups, I would say, are some of the biggest cults in the United States. They have their mantras, they control you, like, you know,
There
like
was
they.
LuLaRoe,
Mhm.
that big documentary series on Amazon that came out, that was actually when you mentioned that, I was just thinking immediately of LuLaRoe, how they had
Mhm.
lured all these women with the narrative of become a millionaire by, you
Yeah.
know, be free and independent and raise your children, and they targeted white, you know, middle class type women in living in
Yep.
suburbs, which
Yeah.
ended up putting a lot of them in debt actually. And yeah.
Yeah, which is also something that Scientology quite often does. Like, so, you know, like there's this element of like dramatically impacting your life, but also fraternity and sorority behavior is cult-like, right? Like you have hazing, you have this kind of like behavior control, you have the sense of being part of a cohesive group that has an identity. So there are lots of, I think in college, I joined the diesel denim cult. So I don't know what that meant specifically. I think all that meant was that I joined Diesel's mailing list in the early social media days. But like there are lots of ways of kind of thinking about and distinguishing what cults are. I would say that even today, like there's a cult of Peloton today, you know, like people who really organize their lives around their Peloton groups, which is fine by and large. So to return to Amanda Montell, she, in her book, quotes Stephen Hassan, who's a mental health counselor and also the author of The Cult of Trump. And he makes a really nice, he kind of builds on this, what she's talking about cultishness as a spectrum. And he adds to that by saying, you know, like groups that kind of move into the destruction environment, like that start to become destructive, they tend to use three kinds of deception. They omit things that you need to know, they distort in order to make whatever they're saying more acceptable, and they'll outright lie to you. So a lot of this comes down to behavior control. And I like this definition because when you start thinking about this definition, you start thinking, oh, like cult in its negative sense can actually be expanded in very dramatic ways. It can be expanded to our perception of politics. It can be expanded to what we consider the economy to be and why it's more important than anything else. And what is the economy specifically? And why do companies and governments think that it says something about the health of a population or a community? You know, like it's really interesting when you kind of start to push against the edges of the term cult, not only in terms of like what can be included in its negative definition, but in terms of what can be included in its more positive definition, in the sense that we're all kind of looking for belonging, and none of us is actually exempt from this desire sometimes to be affiliated, to find our people. There's nothing wrong with that. Like we're the weakest mammals for the longest amount of time. When we're born, we're designed to be this way. So I think that the main thing that you have to watch out for, like acknowledging that cultishness can be a spectrum, is considering in what ways a cult or a commune, for example, like a Christiania in Denmark, or you know, like, I don't know, the Hare Krishnas, have they ever heard anybody? I don't really think so. But like, in what ways do these group dynamics in any context, like including brands, in what ways do they make you thrive? And in what ways are they more destructive for you? And if it occurs to you that they're more destructive for you and you try to pull away, are there punishment behaviors that sort of unlock when you do that? And I actually think that even outside the traditional definition of cult, we are negotiating that all the time. Like mostly,
Yes.
I would say with work or with our families. Some families are extremely big and controlling. Um, so yeah, like once you start unpicking the narrative of a cult, like you kind of realize that they're just like larger and larger circles of cults everywhere you go. And then the distinctions become a lot more important to make between thriving and destruction for you.
That's a very excellent point, because because there's so many news headlines around the violent cults, which
Mm.
usually result in either mass suicide, some act of violence where you have the Branch Davidians in Waco, Texas, for example, or you have the Manson family who committed the very violent murders that led to people being imprisoned supposedly for the rest of their natural lives, but are now apparently being released now. There's so many, and then of course Jim Jones. I mean, we cannot forget that one, the mass suicide. But there's so many examples of these throughout history, even in the last 100 years. I
Yeah.
mean, the United States was rife with cults. Then there was Heaven's Gate with the mass suicide where everyone drank poison essentially and laid in bunk beds. And when we see this in the media, it's so shocking. And it's just so unnatural to think, I would never do something like that. I would never be susceptible to committing suicide in such a fashion. But have you ever been susceptible to a relationship that you knew wasn't right for you, but your emotions led the way? I think inside all of us, or what I find inside all of us, is susceptibility. It's human nature to be susceptible. The other piece of the more violent definition of cults is the degradation of women. That is one that we see that's very common, the abuse and degradation of women. Oftentimes, it's either an excuse for pedophilia, like Warren Jeffs, or an excuse to essentially be a glorified pimp, like what Charles Manson did with the women in his group. And there was this cult-like environment in San Francisco, and now I can't remember the name, but it was about the orgasm, where everybody would have sex, and they celebrated the female orgasm, but what it really became was just this big group of people that, if you were a woman in the group, you were expected to have sex because that defined your liberation. And so remembering those two things about the violent aspects, the mass acts of violence and the degradation of women, bring us to the most shocking points of what that definition means. And I think that's why those examples resonate so deeply with us. I was talking to someone the other day about the Barbie movie, and they said, yeah, Barbie has become a kind of cult. And I said, I'm not sure it's become a cult, but when you really look at it, Mattel is genius. And why is Mattel genius? Because of this movie, this toy company has literally taken what feminism means and wrapped it around a doll that for many, many decades had unrealistic body proportions that caused people body dysmorphia. And I know there's, of course, other backstories to that, but when you really think how this object could be imbued now with so many beliefs of what feminism means and what feminism is, I can see why that person would have used the word cult, but at the same time, is it actually a cult? And then we go back to that piece where we're not sure.
Yeah, there's a lot of complexity here where you're dealing with what's essentially a capitalist product. It's a product functionally that's interacting with us on a lot of like existential levels. Like it's having a lot of really complicated conversations with us at one time through one vehicle, including the complicated conversation about what this doll represents. Like sometimes it has felt like liberation, and other times it has been really constraining for people. And sometimes it can be both at once. I think there are a lot of people, or there are a lot of objects in this culture that are complicated like that, like high heels or hijab or wearing makeup, like these are all fraught with complexity and they're valued in different ways at different moments. But what I wanted to say was, I think that it's not shocking that one of the strengths of the capitalist system is that anytime there's a resistance to it, it can just repackage it and sell it back to you. Like, put it on a t-shirt that you'll buy. That's a very seductive quality of capital. Another thing that I would say is that because this is the water that we swim in, like it's very hard for us to conceive of a different kind of existence because it's the one that we were born into. Many of the ancient stories that need to live on and that we need to be able to repeat for sort of the psychic health of humanity often manifest in this capitalist veneer. Like it makes total sense to me that the Inanna story would reappear today as a story about Barbie. But of course, this is like a total digression. Like, to return us to the topic of cults, I would say, thinking about the examples that you gave, Jess, of like these really extreme and violent outcomes of cults, these are really interesting narratives that get repeated a lot in our society, and it's worth asking ourselves why. Like, what kind of work are those narratives doing? I think it's quite suspect that our first reaction is to reject them for ourselves. That's one big piece of work that those narratives do. Like, I would never personally make that choice. It's like how we feel about Hitler, right? Like, he's just a monster. Like, I would never make that choice. So it kind of like, it distances us already from like the sort of like nuance of humanity. Like, there are 10 million reasons why these things happen and why you might make that choice. And if you ever find yourself making that choice, you might find yourself feeling ashamed and alone because you believe that you're in a world where the vast majority of people don't make that choice. You know, that's dangerous. That's the first thing. The second thing that I would say is positioning these narratives about cults in this way reinforces the primarily extreme negative aspects of cults and also reminds us what cults are. Like cults are these kinds of things and they're negative. And that casts like a huge shadow on the many negative things that are cult like, but that are not distinguished as cults. And also many positive things that are cult like, but that you can't use the word cult with because then, oh, it gets like really messy, you know? So it's always worth us, and I think that's what this entire podcast is about, actually. It's always worth us asking ourselves when we hear a narrative that gets repeated over and over, what kind of work is it doing? Like, what is the objective of repeating that narrative so often? Like, how does it affect you? Like, what stories does it keep reinforcing to you? Is there a moral to the story? One of my favorite things that I kind of imbibed in the last few years is if a story gives you a moral, it is not a story, it's a piece of propaganda. Like, a story is something that should live inside you and complicate your guts a little bit. Like, it should create work inside you, an interaction. If it's telling you exactly how you need to interpret it, there's probably an intent there that you're being subjected to. And quite often this is the case with the narratives that we have about cults. I think you'd agree.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, definitely. That's that desire for absolutism that comes with that, where, okay, now I have this value because of X or Y. Now I have
Yeah.
this set of beliefs because this person handed me this set of beliefs. Building on your point, and this is where I think a lot of brands have a huge advantage, is most people, I mean, the existential question of where we belong in life, what our purpose is, what our direction is something that every person struggles with because it defines our existence in many ways. We want meaning in life. We want to understand, why are we here? Why did I come into being as, an American white woman in this time period? I don't understand how I ended up in this body. And I think that a lot of people go through that. Various world religions have explanations for this. We covered this in another episode about existential quests and how those in mythology and in, movies like the Lord of the Rings, where a person's on a journey to really find meaning, is huge. So when someone can package that for you in an easy definition, they've won, because it takes the difficulty of you having to struggle through your experience to try to understand this meaning. So when someone comes to you and hands you the narrative and says, there's going to be a war within society and mass divisions, but here you're safe because blah, blah, blah. And here's the talking points as to why. And you and I both, having built many communications programs and everything, understand how powerful communications are. Communications are everything. If you speak any language, how you speak defines what you believe, what you think, how you construct your views of the world, and how that language is manipulated affects who you are and how you define yourself and how you define your journey. So that's where I think brands, going back to this, what we call the lighter definition of the cult environment, or the more gentle definition, I would say, and not going to this extreme violence that several of the ones in the previous example had, is that brands kind of give that to us too. Buy X and you are conquering the world, or you are going on an epic journey, and we're here for you in your journey.
Apple is a great example of what you're talking about. Like, you
Definitely.
can tell that like there's definitely a cult of Mac versus PC. I don't think that anyone would argue the opposite. Like, it's a thing that becomes a tension between people sometimes. Like, why would you use that kind of phone, or why would you use that kind of computer? So inefficient. And yeah, in many ways true, right? A software and a hardware are like ways of interacting with the world that are very distinct and different. So, I mean, these are not invalid ideas that Mac people, they do like interact with like technology differently from PC people and vice versa. But the kind of like the ampler that it's taken, like the
Definitely.
side, you know, like
Yes.
yeah, is quite significant. I did my bachelor's dissertation, like my bachelor's thesis, sorry, on a millennial buying behavior. And there were a lot of distinctions between like millennials of different ages, men versus women, different social classes, ethnic groups, but everybody owned a pair of Nikes without exception, everybody across the board. So, you know, like these little identity markers, we might not think of them as cult like, but you know, like they are little ways that we have of communicating, of signaling, you know, a complex series of meanings about, you know, where we belong and where we stand in the world with other people.
So in the second 50 Women, 50 Women Book 2 book, there was a woman whose name is Jennifer, and she talks about being taken to what has been called a reform school called, the name was Escuela Caribe. And then there was a documentary made about it called Kidnapped for Christ as well, where it was called a behavior modification program. Jennifer has referred to it as a cult. And she describes the absolutely horrific conditions that those that were brought to the Dominican Republic were subjected to, under the guise of reforming their behavior, making them better young adults. And I mean, she talks about someone eating glass that was in this group, people threatening suicide. She talks about the conditions that she was under, just absolutely horrific conditions. And one could arguably say, well, no, this was a reform school, not a cult, or this was a behavioral modification program, not a cult per se. The question that comes from that always arose to me from her testimony was, at what point do we draw the line with the definition of cult? And those two women, her and Siobhan Nealon, one says, Jennifer says, no, I was in a cult. I mean, this was a cult. The indoctrination that was occurring, the extreme rules, the belief that this group was imbued by God to save me and to make me a better person and to give me this absolutist view of the world. This was a cult. But then you have Siobhan who says, well, you know, I don't even know if I can call what I grew up in a cult. Some people have called it a cult. Some people call it a commune, but a commune seems like much lighter language, because when we think of a commune, we think of a group of, you know, hippies in the 1960s, living on land, growing plants, smoking reefer, more than likely doing some other drugs, but you know, just that free love, summer of love type of vibe. So it is a tough tightrope to walk. I think you could agree with me, right, Ange?
Yeah,
That,
definitely.
that and so in that case, how would we actually know ourselves if we ourselves are in a cult, when these two people have told me, who've been subjected to sexual abuse and violence and torture and mental exhaustion, when both of them have told me, or at least one of them have told me, I'm not even sure if I was in a cult. It goes back to that whole narrative around victims of domestic violence who often have said, I didn't know I was in an abusive relationship. How do I define that? So we're all susceptible to a cult, I think, to some degree or another. And we all have the capacity to deny to ourselves that we actually are in one, especially when the definition is so malleable.
Thanks for joining us this week. We hope that we expanded your thinking a little bit on all of the narratives surrounding a term that I think a lot of us believe that we understand. And that's part of why narratives are so interesting, right? They kind of lull you into believing that you understand something when you might just understand a particular series of stories about something. And it's really fun for us to dig into the granularities of what we think we understand as well. So thank you always for joining us on this journey. Join us next time when we'll be talking about birth narratives and everything surrounding giving life in all of the ways that one might be able to do that.
That way
And
you can be reborn after your cult experience, maybe.
exactly, it works.
If you can actually figure out that you're in one, that's the trick. So thank you, everyone, and have a lovely day.